Hi everybody, welcome back to the Sweetheart Street Bench Pillow Along. Today is January 16th. We're going to be working on the free Hugs and Kisses and the Valentine Sweet Shop blocks today. If you're just joining the Pillow Along, there'll be a link in the description box below to download your free schedule. I already have everything cut and prepped. We've got our free Hugs and Kisses and our Valentine Sweet Shop. Both blocks need a piece of batting 7.5 by 9.5, and a quick reminder that even though the instructions say medium cutaway stabilizer, I'm using a light mesh cutaway throughout for this project. Let's jump right in. We're going to start with the free Hugs and Kisses block. We're going to have to line up the blocks like we did last time. Let's load our background quilting KDQ 484 Candy 2 6x8 horizontal design. I'm going to move a little bit faster in this video since everything is similar to what we've done in the previous video. I'm looking for my 6x8 horizontal. It's down here at the bottom. We're going to hit set, and then I need to add my embroidery block, and then we're going to need to line that up. Just like last time, there's a really nice picture in the instructions, and if you're not doing the background quilting, you're going to want to start at step 1, stitching out the tick mark and folding the fabric. We did this last time. I like to use edit move and use my arrows rather than to try and drag and drop my file. There we go. You can see the bottom of the signpost right there is lined up with this stitch line right here. The outside stitch line is going to be our trim line. Then there's a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and that's where you want that signpost lined up. I'm going to hit OK. I'm going to save it to my machine in case anything happens, and we'll start our stitch out. I've got a neutral thread on my machine, my light mesh cutaway stabilizer loaded. The background fabric for this block is supposed to be cut at 8.5 by 10.5, and I miscut to 8.5 by 9.5, but the block ends up being trimmed to 8.5 by 6.5, so I'm hoping I'll be okay. It should be fine. I'm going to move through the first steps because they're exactly the same as we did last week. I'll go all the way up through the background quilting, which for this block is done with the pink rose color. And then when the background quilting is done and it's time to start our block, I'll slow it down. 2 thread breaks later, the background quilting is done. On your screen, you probably have that little line with the tick mark, just like last time. You need to move through that, and then there'll be a rectangle. Move through that. I showed you how to do that on the last video. What you should see are some green leaves down in the corner. Those are called the flower, stem, and leaves fill. The color for that is celery. This is the color that I'm using for celery. I showed my color conversions last time. If you need to see those, I'm using a couple of different brands of thread. I'm going to change my thread and stitch that out. Going to switch to the color smoke and stitch out the lollipop stick fill. Going to switch to the color cool gray and stitch out the sign stand placement line. Grab your sign stand fabric. This should have fusible on the back. I believe it said all pieces have fusible. I put the fusible on the back of everything as I was cutting it. It was really easy on the fabric cutting guide with the little hearts next to the fabrics that need fusible. I'm going to tape that in place. We want to stitch the tack down, trim everything outside the tack down line, and then stitch out the satin outline and details. Leave the cool gray on your machine, and we're going to stitch out the signpost fills and then the eyelets details. We're stitching out eyelets because at the end we're going to add the lights. If you don't want to add lights, you can always glue on rhinestones. Let's go ahead and stitch out those 2 steps. Next, we're going to switch to the color Pink Lemonade. We're going to start stitching tack down lines for the signs and tacking them down, but we're not going to do the detail fill until a bit later. So this thread color isn't going to match every sign as we go, but this is the thread color they say to use in the instructions. We'll start by stitching out the signs 1 placement lines. Grab your signs 1 fabric, that's the turquoise looking fabric. You want to make sure to cover both of those signs. They use the same fabric for the top 2. Make sure everything's completely covered. Add a piece of tape, and then we'll stitch the tack down and then trim everything outside of the tack down line. Once you have those trimmed, they're calling these signs 1. We're going to stitch out the sign 2 placement line, place the fabric, tack it down and trim, and then sign 3 and sign 4. I'll go ahead and run it together. It's the exact same thing. Just double check your instructions to look for the colors as you go. Once you've got all the signs done, the next step is done in the same color. We're going to stitch the placement line for the lollipop. We'll place our fabric, tack it down, and trim. I've got the lollipop fabric trimmed. Pink lemonade color is still on my machine. We're going to stitch the satin outline. Once you've stitched out the satin stitch on your lollipop, we're going to switch to the pink rose color, and we're going to stitch out the sign 3 satin outline right here and the candy stripes fill 1. So it's going to start working on that peppermint candy. I'll go ahead and run both of those together. Once those 2 steps are stitched out, you want to switch to your color pink, and we're going to stitch out the candy stripes 2 fills. It's going to fill in the blank spaces on this piece of candy. Keep the color pink on your machine and stitch out the sign 2 satin outline. That's all stitched out. I need to switch to the color Pale Mist, and it's going to stitch out the satin outline for your top 2 signs. They're calling them both signs 1. We're going to switch to the color Cardinal. We have 3 things to stitch out. We're going to stitch out the sign 4 satin outline. Then the machine's going to move up and stitch Free Hugs and Kisses on this sign. And then we'll stitch out the lollipop stripes fill. They are 3 separate steps on the machine. I'm going to go ahead and run them all together. Next, we want to switch to pink rose and stitch out the lollipop stripes details. We get to use a new color. This is the color I'm using for what they've called the Tango. I'm going to put that on my machine. We're going to stitch the heart, flower, decorative fill, and outline. We're going to switch to cool gray, and it's going to stitch out Valentine's Sweet Shop and Cupid's Cupcakes. We're going to switch to white and stitch out Soda Crush, and that's the last thing for this block. This block is done. I had thread stickage on this one too. I don't know if that's the official term, thread stickage, but everything's stitched out fine. I'm going to set this aside, rehoop some stabilizer, and we're going to start on the Valentine Sweet Shop. Let's load our files. We do have to line up files again. Our background quilting this time is the KDQ 483 Candy 1, the 6x8 design. Let's find that one. Right there. Going to go ahead and hit set, and then we're going to add our Valentine Sweet Shop embroidery file right here. And then we need to line that up just like before. I'm going to use edit and move and slide this down so the bottom of my embroidery file lines up with not the very outside line, but the next line. What's going to be the stitching line. That looks good. Going to save it to my machine just in case. We're ready to get started. I'll do the same thing for this block. I'll run everything through the background quilting, which is again in pink rose. And once that's done, we'll work through the block together. The background quilting is all stitched out. You probably have that little line with the tick mark again on your machine. You just need to go through that and then go through the box, and then we'll be ready for the next step. We're going to start with the color Smoke and stitch out the building placement line. Grab your building fabric, make sure it's right side up, and cover that placement line. Then we'll tack it down and we'll trim. Once you've got that trimmed, stitch out the decorative satin outline. Going to switch to cardinal. We're going to stitch out the roof placement line. Grab your roof fabric. This is directional. I cut it this way. It doesn't really matter which way you cut it, but if you want to make sure everything is going up and down, just look at the picture and the instructions and cut it to match. I'm going to take a little bit of extra time lining it up. I'll probably pull this off my machine and make sure that I don't accidentally have it crooked. Then I'll stitch the tack down, trim it, and we'll stitch the roof decorative outline. Switch to the color Lagoon. We're going to stitch out the square windows placement lines. You're going to grab your square windows fabric, but they're actually cut like rectangles. They're 2 by 2.5. So don't get confused like I did. I just stopped and read and thought, well, I've got some rectangles. I don't have any squares. Go ahead and tape those down. We're going to stitch the tack down line and then we're going to trim. Once you've got those trimmed, leave on the color Lagoon. We're going to stitch the square windows decorative outlines. It's going to do the sides and the bottoms of the windows. And the next step is the Candy 1 wrapper fills. They're both in the same color, so I'll go ahead and run those together. Switching to Pale Mist, we're going to stitch the Candy 1 fill. Switch to Cardinal and stitch the Candy 2 wrapper twist fills, and then after that we're going to switch to Pink and stitch out the Candy 2 fill. I'll go ahead and run those two steps together. We need to place our vinyl. When I cut the vinyl from the embellishment kit, I miscut my vinyl. I'm lucky I have some by Annie's vinyl in my stash, so I cut 2 more pieces, 2.5 by 2. The by Annie's vinyl has a piece of paper on it, so I have to peel off the paper, and then we're going to place these like that. And it's nice because the paper's attached. I know that the side that is attached to the paper is clean. Normally I sit there for 5 minutes and I use my eyeglass cleaning cloth and I clean the vinyl, but I know everything that's touching the paper is going to be clean. I will double check it though. You're going to place them like that. I'm going to add a piece of tape along the bottom and along the top. Switch to the color Lagoon and stitch out the tack down lines. Everything looks good. Let's stitch the tack down. Once it's tacked down, you want to trim carefully around the edges. There's no decorative stitch that's going to go around this. It's what they call a raw, R-A-W, edge applique. Don't worry about this part here at the top. It looks a little messy. We're going to be stitching out awnings, so don't worry about the way that this looks right now. Once your vinyl's trimmed, you're going to keep this Lagoon color on your machine. We're going to stitch out the sign placement line. Grab your sign fabric, cover the placement line, stitch the tack down, and then trim. Once that's trimmed, stitch out the sign satin outline. Switch to Pink Rose. We're going to stitch out the round window placement line. That's going to stitch out on top of that red roof fabric. Grab your round roof fabric, which is a square this time. Cover the round roof placement line. I'm going to go ahead and tape that into place. We're going to stitch the tack down and then trim. Once that's trimmed, you're going to stitch out the round window decorative outline and crossbars details. If you're adding the vinyl, make sure it's clean. This one did come from the embellishment kit, so I have my eyeglass cleaning cloth. I'm going to hold it up to the light. Looks nice and clean. Cover the window, tape it in place, and stitch the tack down. But before I do that, I see a couple loose threads. I'm going to pull this off the machine, trim the loose threads, then put my vinyl down. Got it all cleaned up, taped in place. Going to tack it down and then trim the vinyl. The window's all trimmed. I still have Pink Rose on my machine. We're going to stitch out the chimney top fills. Next, we're going to stitch out the chimney fabric placement line. I've got my chimney fabric. You want to cover the placement line, stitch the tack down, trim the extra fabric away, and then stitch the chimney satin outline. Leave this color on, that's the Pink Rose. Stitch the awning stripes 1 fills. We're going to switch to cardinal. There's 4 separate steps on the machine. I'll run them together. The first thing will be the stripes on the awning. So you've got the pink ones. Now it'll stitch the remaining ones, which are red. Then we'll go up and we'll stitch the little eyelets. That's going to be where we put our fairy lights. Then Valentine Sweet Shop will stitch on the sign. And then there's a little heart above the words on the sign. I'll go ahead and run all those together. Next, we want to switch to white. We're going to stitch out the placement line for the door. Apparently I didn't push the button hard enough, so you just saw the very end of that. We've got our placement line here for the door. Go ahead and cover that with your door fabric. Stitch the tack down, trim, and then when you stitch the door satin outline, it's also going to stitch a little doorknob. I'm actually going to pull this off my machine again and make sure I get this on straight because it'll bother me if it ends up being crooked. The door and the doorknob detail are all done. We're going to stitch out the board and batten details. You stitch that in white. This block is all stitched out. Let's head over to our table and trim up our blocks. You might have some jump threads. Don't forget to take care of those. We're going to trim our blocks to 6.5 by 8.5. If you have the rectangle orange pop rulers, that's the center ruler. This is easier than last week's blocks. They were 4.5 by 8.5, so we used the small one, took the small one out, and then finished with this one. For this one, we've got the correct size, 6.5 by 8.5. I talked about the orange pop rulers last time and how to use them. I'm going to go ahead and trim both my blocks. They're both trimmed. This one makes sense to me. You've got your 1/4 inch seam allowance. That will disappear in the seam. When I saw this as I was cutting, I got a little nervous. See how this stitching here goes all the way to the bottom? I looked in my instructions on page 22. That's exactly what it's supposed to look like. It kind of looks like the signpost is floating and then the candy goes right to the bottom. What that means is when we go to stitch this into our pillow, here's our 1/4 inch seam allowance. It's going to stitch in like that. Some of this is going to get caught in the seam allowance. We've stitched out our blocks for this week. Let's look and see what's coming up next. I'll be back on January 23rd. We'll stitch out Soda Crush and Cupid's Cupcakes. A couple other things going on my channel. The Applique of the Month Club has arrived. I filmed an unboxing. I'll link that below. I'll be stitching that out next. I'll have a full start to finish tutorial for the runner for January. I've completed my filming for the 6-inch block project, Perfectly Pieced Teacups. There's lots of writing on here because I made some changes as I went along. This one will be edited after I edit and post Sweetheart Street. So this one will post after Sweetheart Street. Then you'll see Applique of the Month. And then also in the background is still our Feeling Festive Bella box. I do want to make the little teacup zipper pouch. However, as a Kimberbell affiliate, there are some things coming out that Kimberbell is going to send my way. Thank you so much, Kimberbell. This Bella box is something I purchased, so it has to wait if I have things to film with a deadline. Worst case scenario, it might sit a bit, but we're definitely going to keep working on this. I've stitched out the polar bear rice warmer, the snow place like home tiling scene, and while I haven't stitched out this snap tray, I do have a video on my channel for how to stitch a leather snap tray by Kimberbell. I'll go ahead and link that below. If you're just joining in this stitch along, there'll be a link in the description box below for the Sweetheart Street bench pillow along schedule. Thank you so much for watching. Please be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Leave any comments below the video. And if you heard construction noise, they're working on that craft room. I think you're going to hear background noise for at least the next couple of months. Any background bird noise is either our canary or our Rosella parrot. Enjoy. I'll see you next time. I'll be back on January 23rd to stitch out Soda Crush. Oh, for crying out loud.